Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Voices That Heal podcast. I am your girl, Jaymie. I'm so excited to be with you tonight. This is our last podcast for 2024. I can't believe it. I'm actually really excited about this one. I feel like we've maybe saved the best podcast for the last month of the year. But for those that don't know or aren't familiar with me, I am a stage 4 lung cancer survivor, was diagnosed in December of 2018 with stage 4 ALK positive lung cancer. I've been affiliated with the Heal Collaborative team now for a little more than a year and some change, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Part of what I do for them is I have these real conversations with subject matter experts and other people in the field who can really give us insights and advice and just conversation about some of the things that us cancer patients are curious about, things that we're not sure about, and just otherwise sort of unmystifying some of these things that we deal with in our journeys. So I thought it was very important to talk through this idea of clinical trials and what they are. I know that there's a lot of, background and backstory as to why participation in the African American community is so low. But I wanted to hopefully bring on 2 subject matter experts tonight to talk through why it's important that we have these clinical trials, talk about some of the everyday, over-the-counter medications that we use on a regular basis that went through this process, that so that we can live our regular lives, and try to help take away some of the scariness behind clinical trials. So I don't want to take up any more time than I need to. Just as a reminder, we are live on Facebook and YouTube via the Heal Collaborative pages. So if you have questions, concerns, comments, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Definitely excited to hear what engagement comes from this evening's conversation. I know that there's going to be some interesting takes on, the ideas behind clinical trials. So I'm very curious, and we welcome all your feedback in the comments this evening. So I'm going to bring both of my guests onto the stage with me today and let them introduce themselves. I am going to be joined tonight by Dr. Theresa Jacobs and Dr. Cynthia Obiozor, who are going to be our subject matter experts this evening on clinical trials and what you can expect. So Dr. Jacobs, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, give a little bit of background about how you got into this field, and then we'll pass it over to Dr. Cynthia.
All right. Thank you, Jaymie. I am Dr. Theresa Jacobs. I'm a family medicine doc. Been practicing for just about 30 years. I am the medical director for the Georgia Primary Care Association, as well as the Georgia Family Planning System. The Georgia Primary Care Association is the governing body for FQHCs, or community health centers. And then family planning is that Title 10 grant here in the state of Georgia. And so as a primary care provider and a family member who has participated in trials. I've had family members and friends who have participated in trials, and we've also have referred several folks to trials. So I think this is such a relevant topic on today. So glad, Jaymie, that you have me here with you all today. Looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have you here. And Dr. Cynthia, you're up next.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Cynthia Obiozor. I'm a physician oncologist and hematologist. So I work directly in cancer. And for the last about 10 years, I've been working as it pertains to clinical trials. So I design them, I manage them. I've seen them from early phase to late phase. So it's really an honor to be here to have this discussion and just provide some insight into that world. So thank you for having me.
Yes, and I guess you guys can tell by the people on this conversation this evening that we're getting ready to have a really good conversation. So couldn't have picked 2 better people to join me tonight. So ladies, let's jump right in and just start discussing. First and foremost, let's get, all of the ABCs out of the way, if you will. Can one of you guys kind of talk through what a clinical trial actually is and why it's important for, health and wellness?
So Dr. Jacobs, I could go ahead or you could go ahead. Okay. So a clinical trial is basically a research study. It basically looks at, evaluates new and upcoming therapies. And this is not limited to medication. This is for medical devices as well. And that where there's thoughts that it can improve any number of treatments. So basically it's a research study looking to improve what is already out there on the market. And the reason that it's helpful, we need it for clinical trials, or we need it to ensure diversity, is we need to make sure that the medication is safe across everybody, not just the select few. So diversity in clinical trials is really important going forward, and making sure that we have the same amount of people in the clinical trials as that represents our actual population. So,
Dr. Jacobs, you want to add to that?
No, I think that's perfect. For diseases that are already out there, existing diseases, to see if we can prevent them, cure them, to help slow up the disease process in some instances. And so clinical trials, as Dr. Obiozor said, are absolutely necessary.
And to go along with that as well, I know that there are phases to the clinical trial. So I believe there's 4 phases, but I've seen research that they go up even higher than that in some cases, I guess, based on the complexity of what you're studying. So can you talk through what some of those phases are? I guess maybe you guys can split them in half if you want to do it that way, but just talk through like what phase 1 is and what that means. And then, as we go through, just kind of what those different phases look like and what they may sort of entail for the patients that are going through them.
Yeah, I'll start. And it would, and actually, Jaymie, some people actually will say that there's a phase 0. And those are, that's the stage where they're still in the lab and maybe they're doing some animal studies or research studies on those animals. And then phase 1, you actually have humans, you have actual people. And there's a small number of folks that will participate in that, usually less than 15 folks or so. And that's when you're looking to see about the dosage, what types of dosage would be appropriate as far as patients. And even in this stage, you're looking to see whether or not, should it be a pill? Should it be an injection? Should it be a salve or a cream or an ointment? What would be the best efficacy for this particular medication if we're talking about medications? That's phase 1.
Dr. Cynthia, do you want to do phase 2?
Yeah. So phase 2 is really about finding and really optimizing the dose and taking a closer look at the safety and efficacy, but mainly the safety. I get a lot of questions about, is this drug safe? Well, early on in the study, in the early phase, what we call early phase, phase 1 and phase 2, this is where we make sure that it's not only that not only the efficacy is there, but that it's also safe. Because if the side effects outweigh the effectiveness, there's no point in producing the medication. So you want to make sure that the medication is tolerable. This happens mainly in the phase 1, phase 2 space, early phase, what we call it.
Can we talk about that for a quick second? I'm only asking because, we all see those late night, 3:00 in the morning commercials where it's like, have you or a loved one taken aspirin? And have you experienced or it just goes through this laundry list of symptoms and side effects. And you're like, okay, at what point is it not worth, taking aspirin to get rid of my headache if side effects are liver damage and all this crazy stuff? So, I mean, what's the baseline for that? Because sometimes these side effects seem like, is it really worth it?
Yeah. So they take a look at that in the phase 2 studies. They get the feedback from the patients involved in these studies is what is considered tolerable, right? So if I have a huge headache, a huge headache, right? Mm-hmm. If the medication is going to give me a small side effect that I can kind of deal with, let's just say deal with, what would I rather have? My headache resolved or that little side effect, So it's really just weighing your options, basically. So yes, and so for some people, again, evaluated in phase 2, some people will have more side effects than others. Then we need to look at, okay, what it is about this patient or this person's metabolic profile makes them more susceptible to side effects than person A. So and again, this is why we need lots of people, lots of diverse backgrounds in clinical trials, because if we have the same type of background in one clinical trial, what may be a side effect to person A may not be side effect to person B in a different demographic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Jaymie, I'll add, and it's in this phase too where everybody that's in that trial, regardless to what they say that the side effect is, it has to be recorded. And so if it's a headache, if they were nauseated, whatever they say, these are the symptoms that I've had since I've been in this trial, it all has to be recorded. And where it gets interesting to me, if 50% of the folks that are in that trial are all saying they have headaches, then that's probably a pretty viable side effect of that particular medication. But if you had just maybe one person say, well, I had a little rash here, it came and it went, that may not necessarily be a side effect of the medicine. And so that's why it is really important that you get as many diverse folks in the trials as possible, so you can see what it is that folks are concerned about, if they are having any particular side effects. And then you have to look at the backgrounds. You got to look at what other things are going on with those individuals as well that's in the studies.
Right. And so it makes sense when we talk about getting, additional participation from the Black community, because we have a lot of diseases that we're susceptible to that run rampant through our community. We have sickle cell, heart disease, kidney problems, all that kind of stuff that may not necessarily be represented effectively if the pool of people that they're testing does not have those same kind of symptoms. So you're not getting a full broad scope of what's happening with if you're not including everybody in the community. And that makes a lot more sense when you put it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So then when we move into phase 3, that's the phase where we look at if the new treatment is better than the standard, or what does phase 3 look like for a clinical trial?
Yeah, exactly right there. So now is the new treatment. We're going to compare it to what else is out there as well. And this is where we get as many folks as we possibly can to enroll into the studies. So we can look at it across our races, ethnicities, and frequently across age groups, younger people, senior citizens like me. I'm 69. Can we get some of us in the trials as well in the studies? And so you're going to look at it across the board. And then what's out there already, is it comparable or is it better than what's already out there? So absolutely correct. So that's the third step. And that's during this phase is when a trial will be approved, basically. And depending on how many side effects, if there are side effects, if there's good efficacy or good effects to the medication, and it's doing exactly what the researchers are hoping that it would do. And then at this point, it's time to get ready to see if they can get it approved through the FDA.
And so then based on that, if there's this is the first of its kind medication, where there may be addressing something that hasn't had a previous, medication to compare against, what does that look like in the process? Does that make it harder? Does it make it easier to pass? What is that process like?
So I'll just add, in the phase 3, you're comparing the new agent, the new thing, to standard of care or to nothing at all, because in that situation, there is nothing, right? And so what you want to do is look at, are the patients just better off with supportive care, meaning you're just taking care of the illness, not treating it, or actually treating it with this new medication? So that is the same thing. You have your 2 or more arms in this phase 3. And when I say arms, groups of people getting either standard of care or nothing, because there's nothing available, or the new drug, or something else miscellaneous. So a lot of times I get a lot of questions. Well, I don't want the placebo drug. Well, the only, or the sugar pill, the sugar pill. I always say, if the sugar pill or the placebo is an option, that means there is really nothing out there that has been approved for that particular indication. So it's not a trick. It's not a setup. There's really nothing else out there. Yeah. We haven't proven that what the new therapy is better than doing nothing at all. And that's okay too, so.
Thank you for saying that.
I think a lot of people get a little bit skeptical or just like a hold off, because they're not going to get the real drug. But you can't have a phase 3. And like Dr. Jacobs mentioned, these are large studies, the phase 3. We're talking hundreds to thousands of patients, right? Because at every point we're collecting data. And so we can't just have people getting the placebo for no good reason, right? So I just want to make that clear.
Right. And I think from a cancer patient perspective too, it's we always kind of worry about that, because a lot of times when we hop on a clinical trial, it's because this is our last option in most cases. It's hey, everything else traditionally has failed us. And so now there's this new hope in a clinical trial. And so the idea of us getting, no treatment at all and getting a placebo is always a scary thing. So I appreciate you kind of unmystifying that a little bit for the audience and making folks understand, reasoning and stuff like that. Dr. Jacobs, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, like with HIV, that's one of those, several of those antiviral drugs that came out for HIV. At one point, there was not a lot to treat patients that were HIV positive. And then we got to a point where we had a patient would have to take like 10 drugs in a course of a day. And then the next set of trials, now patients take one or two drugs a day. That viral load just steadily going down. And so, and when you compare that to the placebo group or the group that didn't get the antiviral medications, frequently those trials can be stopped in the midst and say, hey, look, the medication is doing wonderful. These folks' viral loads are getting down to zero. Let's stop this and go ahead and pull in the placebo group as well. So they've done that for trials as well.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. So hopping over to stage 4 of clinical trials, or phase 4 of clinical trials, what does that one look like?
So those are the ongoing studies now. Now that it's been approved, and now you're looking at long-term effects, long range. What's going on with the patient, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years out, 3 years out. And so they're looking at long-term effects of that particular drug or procedure or whatever it is that they're testing. What has happened after it's been approved?
I'll just add, and I like people to think about it like this. You don't want to just know the drug works now. You want to know what's going on long after you either cured or slowed down the disease process, right? So these, what we call them post-marketing analysis, post-approval evaluations, these phase 4 studies, they go on for years. And again, at the very beginning, you asked, well, why when in the middle of the night, I see this long list of side effects? Well, that's why. From phase 1 all the way onward, you're collecting all this data. And just like you mentioned, Dr. Jacobs, if even one person complains of a rash, it will be on that list because everything has to be listed. So the importance of these ongoing studies post the FDA approvals is to ensure that long-term, these drugs are still safe.
How long is that period? There's no timeline on it? Is that just based on the drug itself? Or like, is there like a standard of how long they're monitoring folks? And what does that look like for patients who are, on that drug? Do they have to keep continuing to come into this clinic? Is it like maybe a survey they take? What does that look like for patients on the patient side of it?
Yeah. So I've done clinical trials where the patient the study has finished enrolling, right? And don't forget, the phase 3 can go on for anywhere from several years and onwards, right? Okay. Because it depends on what statistical analysis they're doing, what information they're looking for. So even before you get to the phase 4 studies, you have patients that have been sitting on the phase 3 study for like 5, 6, 7 years, right? And that's simultaneously the phase 4 studies going onwards, right? So it just really depends on the indication, the drug, the disease process, but it goes on for a very long time.
Right. Those COVID patients, I'm one of those COVID patients that got one of the initial vaccines. I still get a check-in on my cell phone to see how I'm doing. And we're 5 years out now.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you guys are telling me this information, which is great, but like I read somewhere that if you're in one phase of a trial, you can't be in another phase of the trial. Is that correct? Or is there like overlap in certain ways? Because you just said phase 3 can go into phase 4. So if you're in, say, phase 2 of a clinical trial, are you there for this full thing, or are you only there for a certain section of it?
So when I say phase 3 and ongoing to phase 4, the phase 3 patients are the phase 3 patients. And then what happens is they'll design a way to look maybe at the people who have gotten the drugs off of this study to also analyze those patients as well, in addition to utilizing the data from the patients on the phase 3 study. So not to confuse anyone, but if you're on a phase 3, you're on a phase 3 study.
Yeah.
Okay. Got you.
Right. So, and those in phase 1 and 2 answered specific questions for the researchers. Mm-hmm. And once they've answered those specific questions, so it depends on what the medication is and what the purpose is as to whether or not they will be enrolled in from 1 to 2 to 3. So it just depends.
Yeah. I'd like to add, Jaymie, we have what we call a hard stop or a go, no go in the early phase. And when I say early phase, phase 1, 2 studies where, like I mentioned before, if we don't think it's safe or the side effects outweigh the benefits, there is no phase 3 study. It never goes there. So I get a lot of times, well, is this phase 3 study safe? We've already made it to phase 3. We're allowed to do this phase 3 study. At this point of the game where you're being enrolled into this clinical trial, the thought process is the efficacy is better than any side effects that have been reported to date. So I want to just appease some people with regards to some kind of inhibitions about getting on clinical trials and wondering about safety. And I know we'll get to kind of what things we have in place to make sure clinical trials are safe, but I did want to make sure that we didn't leave this kind of segment without stressing that point.
So and I'm trying to put this together in my head as you guys are speaking about it. So I'm thinking about chemotherapy and radiation and how much damage that does to your body when you have that done. I mean, obviously it's something that's needed for cancer, but the side effects of chemo seem like they might be, just long-term pretty bad. So, I mean, I don't even know what I'm trying to ask you guys here. I'm just thinking it's in my head and I'm trying to put it together. I probably should have thought it through and let it bake a little bit more in that oven before I put it out there. But I'm trying to figure out how to ask the question. If anybody listening kind of gets what I'm going for here, but it's is there ever going to be a point where maybe chemo and radiation the side effects of those are no longer, better than before, if that makes sense? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll say this, in the oncology space, there is a focus on what we call targeted directed therapies, where, for example, if someone had a lung cancer with a specific mutation, the goal is to, in lieu of giving chemo, right, is to give a drug that targets only on that mutation that's driving the cancer. And this is for several reasons. The medication is now has a better safety profile, right? Because instead of targeting all the cells, they're focused only on the cells that have that have that mutation on them. So I will say, I kind of think I got an idea of what you're asking.
Yeah.
But there has been a big shift in the cancer space of only looking to attack or target the driver mutation or the mutation causing the cancer. And a lot of drugs you'll see that's the goal. A lot of medications, or utilizing your own body's immune system to fight the cancer. And in that way, you get a more specific therapy with less side effects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a proponent of that. So I'm ALK positive. So I definitely am on targeted therapy. And so that's why I'm chemo it just seems like with biomarker testing and the ability to really pinpoint what's going on. I mean, for those folks that don't have biomarkers, unfortunately, that's, there is no real targeted therapy for you. But for those folks that do, it just seems like chemo should be your absolute last shot. I just feel like the side effects of chemo are so crazy when it comes down to what it does to your body that it's it's hard. It's very difficult. So, and side effects for the medication that I'm on, is kind of, it's run of the mill type stuff, like like you said, you can live with it,
Yeah.
Would I like to live with weight gain? Absolutely not. But in the grand scheme of things, I can work around that. Little humor there. Anyway. So I want to talk about the informed consent, because that brings us also into our conversation about history and what happened previously. Can we talk about what some of the informed consent information is that's given to the patient before they take part in a clinical trial?
Dr. Jacobs, go ahead, feel free.
And it sounds like we're rolling into the Tuskegee study where there was no informed consent. And if I can I'll tell the story real quick. And for many folks have heard of the Tuskegee study, but they don't really know some of the details. They just remember, it was a study. It was horrible. And so we're never going to get into a trial. We're never going to do a study because they use us as guinea pigs, basically. And unfortunately, the Tuskegee study was they used a group of Black men in rural Alabama that were positive for syphilis. And the goal was to see not treating these patients for syphilis, not telling them they had syphilis, and allowing the disease to take its course. And so they wanted to see if it caused they wanted to compare, actually, there was a study done over in Norway some years prior. It was an observational, a back look, they look back, a retrospective study where they look back at some white males that had syphilis, and they look back in their medical records to see what conditions they developed from having syphilis. And most of those men had nerve damage or neurosyphilis. And so here in the United States, they wanted to see, well, do Black men have the same issues? Or the question really was, we think that they will have more cardiovascular issues because of the blood pressure and the diabetes issues. And so they got these men into the study, and they were poor. Many of them could not read or write. And so they promised them meals. If they would go to the clinic, they would treat them. They got free medical care for everything but the syphilis. And even after penicillin, the cure for syphilis came out, they still did not offer. They refused to give these folks give them penicillin to help cure the disease. Some of the men tried to enroll or enlist into the armed forces. When they were tested and armed forces folks found out they were positive for syphilis, the researchers refused to allow them to be treated for syphilis and refused for them to be told that they had syphilis. And so these men went on to give many of their spouses, their girlfriends syphilis, and then there were children that were born with congenital syphilis. And so this went on for 40 years. And the only reason these folks stopped was because it was discovered, it was published in news reports, and the government was pressured to make these folks stop. And so this particular study stopped in 1972. Can you believe it? 1972. And so there was no informed consent. So what is informed consent is that you're supposed to tell the patient. They didn't even tell the patients the name of the study. They just called it the study. That study was for men with syphilis, and they wanted to see how it progressed in these men. So they didn't even tell them. They told them it was for bad blood. That was that was the study. And so unfortunately, there were a number of men that died as a result of this. Partners, and as I said, some children that were born with congenital syphilis. And so informed consent is telling a patient exactly what the study is, exactly what it entails, what are you going to be tested for, and patients should be able to have an opt-out clause. If they don't want to be in this study anymore, they ought to be allowed to get out of the study at any given point in time, which these folks in the Tuskegee study were not given that opportunity to opt out. They were basically held hostage, and they just did not know that, even as I said, in the midst of the study, not even 10 years into the study, there was a cure for the syphilis, and they were not offered at all during the 40 years a cure for syphilis, which is horrible. So no informed consent. And this is a rule, a law, a regulation now, is that anybody that enrolls into a study or a trial must be informed as to what is entailed in the study. If there were blood draws, these men were subject to spinal taps, blood draws. It's just, they were given arsenic. They were given mercury. They were given any and everything except for penicillin to cure it. And the researchers knew that penicillin was available and refused to give it to them. So that you have to tell folks what it is they're getting into, what is entailed, and the fact that they can get out at any given point. And then I'll stop at that point.
Yeah, that is intense. And as I was looking through, there was actually an additional similar experiment that was done in Guatemala. That was, even recently, it's the same thing, it was kind of the same entire preface where, testing folks for syphilis and really not just trying to see what the course of the disease is going to be, so there was not just one, but two. There was one here in the United States and one in Guatemala, but that, as you can see, like that would be is a very real reason for the distrust of the healthcare system in the Black community, you know, and why so many, I honestly think why so many just men in general just don't go to the doctor, you know, because they're just concerned about, you know, number one, head in the sand kind of situation. You know, you don't want to know, so you don't go to the doctor. But also there's this inherent distrust that, like, you know, what are you guys really doing and what's really happening when I go here? But, you know, like you said, Dr. Jacobs, there are so many topics on the informed consent. I have a list here. It says the purpose of the research, who's eligible to participate, the expected length of time for the participation, description of the procedures, exams, and tests that will be part of the trial, any description of the expected risks that come with the trial, possible discomforts, injections, frequency of blood tests, etc., the handling of your data, which is also important. So your confidentiality, the record keeping, FDA inspections, who covers the cost of a clinical trial if it causes injury, participant rights. So, you know, like you said, the right to stop and the right to opt out if you don't want to be a part of it, and then who to contact if you have questions. So all of these things are standard when it comes to a clinical trial. And if, you know, if you're out there and you're in a part of a clinical trial and it's not, then get out immediately, you know, but that is standard on any above ground and above within, you know, government correct clinical trial. That is standard for a procedure. Cynthia, did you want to add anything to that? I saw you were getting ready to say something.
No, you guys have, this is the most comprehensive discussion on informed consent I've been a part of. Actually. I'll just reiterate, anything that is to go down or to happen on that clinical trial must be in that informed consent document. And I want to stress, this is not somebody just telling you. It is not the physician or the clinical research director having a conversation with you. There's a document that you sign. There's a document that you get to take a copy of it home. And I've told people, I've sent people in the clinic, go home and read it. Come back next week, highlight anything you need, come back next week and let's discuss it. Because I want to make sure that you have read what's in this document and there is a complete understanding of everything in this document. Nothing that is not listed in that document happens on that clinical trial. And there's times where, for whatever reason, I've had to change the clinical trial for the betterment of the patient. We have to all of a sudden draft a new informed consent and have the patient come back and sign it. Now, you could have a long-term follow-up where you're not even on the drug anymore. We're just watching you, sending in text messages. How you do it? You know, like they do for you, Dr. Jacobs. And you have to sign a new informed consent because we've changed something and you have to be made aware. If you are on a clinical trial and have not signed a document at the top that says in big bold letters, informed consent, you should be on that clinical trial. If you have a question about a clinical trial that somebody can't answer that question, you should be on that clinical trial. So I just want to really stress the importance of the informed consent. Nothing starts, we don't even look at the patient until we get a signed informed consent document.
And to go along with informed consent, they now have IRBs, which are your institutional review boards, which basically every funded clinical trial has to go through. Can you guys talk about what that is and what that means for the clinical trial?
So all clinical trials will happen through an institution. And so once, say, for example, if I developed a clinical trial, designed it, was told I could move forward by the FDA, I will now send a copy of the clinical trial details to this facility, whether it be a hospital or whatnot, right? Each facility has what they call an IRB, Institutional Review Board, and they will analyze that document. And they will say, we like this, we don't like this. They'll ask us questions. And until the institutional review, the IRB feels 100% about that clinical trial, you'll never even see an informed consent because they have to sign off on the protocol, on the clinical trial before that even sees one patient. So we talked about safeguards with regards to clinical trials. You have government oversight, right? You have the institutional review board or research board at your facility, and then you have the informed consent. So you have multiple pathways before you even get to the patient, before you even start drug. And I haven't even talked about within the clinical protocol or the clinical trial inclusion or exclusion criteria that would say yay or nay to you being on the clinical trial. So it's basically a group of governing body within the institution that reviews the clinical trial in entirety, making sure that it's safe for its patient population in that facility.
Is that similar to the community engagement portion of it, or is this totally separate group of people? Because I know there's a community aspect to it.
Yeah, this is separate. These are people strictly for looking at the clinical trial and make oversight of the clinical trial in the hospital. So your doctor has oversight, your institution has oversight, the FDA has oversight, and then the company backing the drug has oversight. So there are multiple people watching multiple people, if that makes sense. And then the community outreach is separate. And I can let Dr. Jacobs speak to the community outreach.
Sure. Right. Yeah, because we're one of the community engagement groups, our association. And when we look at studies and clinical trials that involve any of our patients at community health centers, we have to make sure that it's safe. We have to make sure that it is beneficial for our patients. And the other thing now we look at, we want to make sure it's sustainable. If it's something, you bring something wonderful into our community and you only do it while you got money, and then when the money's gone, and then now my community is left with nothing, or no way to have access to this wonderful thing you just brought into this community. We don't allow those types of trials or studies to come to our communities anymore. If it's not sustainable, if it doesn't help the entire community, then we don't allow those trials to come to our communities. So we don't back those. So lots of safeguards in place now.
And there's one more that I want to highlight. There's a lot of rules and there's a lot of acts and things and guidelines that are in place. And we're not going to go through all of them because just for the interest of time, we could be here all night talking about the safeguards that are in play. But there are a lot now. But one of the main things I think is educational programs and training that the folks have to go through to make sure that they're understanding, what's ethical and what's not and stuff like that. So can we talk about, I don't know, does Dr. Jacobs, does your organization do anything with education and training, or can you talk about that a little?
Well, we partner with the institution. And almost always the institution is a university because we go through their IRB and we sit down with them and we make sure that the education part of it is basically on a 4th grade level so that all of our patients will understand. If it needs to be translated, we make sure that there's translators involved as well. We make sure that there are handouts. So we participate in the educational part, in that whatever you put out, whatever education you're doing is on a level that our patients will understand.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Is there anything else in terms of safeguards that you guys want to bring up or discuss with the audience that is, monumental for making sure that these clinical trials remain ethical and safe for people that are taking part?
I'll add, given that I design and I've managed clinical trials, when I got into the clinical trial space after training, I was actually shocked at how much education we had to do in order to even begin to get our foot wet with regards to designing clinical trials. You want to ensure that the clinical trials are ethical, they're safe. That when you look at a large group of people, you're not, disparaging one group for another. So there's a lot of safeguards in place with regards to training, even on our end, when we design the clinical trials, to make sure that whatever we put out before it even gets to the patient is a safe and equitable clinical trial.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, what are some of the things that we should consider when we are thinking about taking part in a clinical trial. I know I've sat in on some focus groups that, I guess we're trying to, actually, I want to ask you guys what role focus groups play on clinical trials, because I did sit in on one that was kind of like gauging if we would participate in one based on what the scope was, so it was like telling us how often we have to go into the clinic. What are we needing to do? What's compensation? Because sometimes you can be compensated for these things. Is there some kind of allowance for housing or something, or transportation if it's far away from where you are? So can we talk about focus groups a little bit, and like what are some of those criteria that we need to consider when we're considering a clinical trial?
So I was just going to say now, focus groups, I think, are just either a focus group or go to the community where the people are. and ask them some questions. Go to some of the community leaders that are there, because that's the only way you can get some of these folks that I call them church folks. You get the pastor, you get some trusted figures in the community to sit down with you, and some of those community folks to sit down and tell them what you want to do. And it's interesting because we've had researchers to come in to say, well, this is what we want to do. This is the trial we're looking at. And I was amazed at the fact that they actually listened to the community. They said, well, if you're going to do that, you need to do it this way in order to get more participation. And we will help you get the message across so you can get as much participation as you possibly can. But the researchers, if they will listen to the community, more likely they are to get the buy-in from those from different, races, ethnicities, backgrounds, if they would listen to the community to help them get it, to get that study in certain communities. So I love that idea that they're doing that now.
Yeah. If you don't have any patients, you don't have a clinical trial. So it's always in the best interest for the sponsor or the pharma company to ensure that the clinical trial can be utilized in the population they're trying to launch the clinical trial. So for example, if I have a clinical trial, but I ask you to come to the doctor's office every day, 7 days a week, nobody's going to sign up for this, right? If I'm taking significant amounts of blood daily, nobody wants to sign up for this. This is already a stressful situation. The goal is not to have a clinical trial that adds more stress to the patient, right? So they do these focus groups, they do these discussions with the research and key opinion leaders to ensure that this is a sustainable, Dr. Jason, like you mentioned, clinical trial. Otherwise, you'll get somebody who enrolls and then will just quit, understandably so. And so when you just quit a clinical trial like that, unfortunately, you take the drug away from yourself. But also, when you look at the long-term data, there is none, right? Because the patient has left. Or you, at the very beginning, could have made a trial amenable to the people or the population that you're trying to get them to get to enroll in the clinical trial. So, yes, focus groups, talking to the researchers talking to the patient, everyone talking to each other is very important. Very important in the clinical trial design.
And I found it interesting because it was about an hour-long focus group, and we just literally were talking about the ins and outs of what their clinical trial was and what it would entail. And they were asking if we as patients would be inclined to take part in that. What are some of the things that are red flags? What are some of the things that we'd want to see? What are the questions that we had? So they were really like polling the audience. And I wasn't sure, I'm like, maybe clinical trials, maybe focus groups are part of this process now, where it's like, that is kind of the community engagement portion where you're engaging to see like, how do we put this together and how do we get as many patients as possible within certain communities? So I thought it was interesting. It was only ever one that I did. I'd never had another one pop up, but I thought it was one of the ones that stood out for me because it really opened my eyes to like some of the ins and outs of clinical trials that I didn't think about. Like, oh yeah, this is something where like, every 3 months I got to go in and I got to give 10 vials of blood, or, every 6 months I have to go in and consult with like a doctor and do all of these tests and scans to be on this clinical trial. There's just a lot of things that I didn't think about when it came to it. It was just a lot of layers to that onion that I hadn't even thought about peeling back. So it was definitely good information to have when I sat in on it, because it opened my eyes a little bit to like, okay, I need to be thinking about, time off from work and things like that if I'm going to be doing a clinical trial. So, yeah. I wanted to turn it over a little bit and talk about why, we kind of have hit on it throughout the evening, but I want to talk a little bit about why it's important that we get more of us in the room for these clinical trials. Like, what are some of these healthcare disparities that we can kind of get rid of? And what are some of the benefits of having, our participation in these trials across the board? So I know obviously with healthcare disparities, there's a lot of things that run in our community and a lot of things that run in our families and a lot of things that, are just genetic, for us and socioeconomic. So, when we talk about, control groups for those things, is there a way, or is there, I guess what I'm trying to find out is what's the best way to do that to kind of capture as many of us as possible? Like, I know it's hard because these groups or these clinical trials are only in certain areas, you know what I mean? So it's like, you may not, if you're in Alabama, you may not get a California patient, So like, how are we sort of leveling the playing field across the board, across the United States or whatever, to get some of these disparities addressed?
So let me give you a little statistic. For example, African Americans make up about 13% of the population in the US. So with regards to the clinical trial enrollment, you would think, or you would hope, that we also make 13% of, or a similar amount of percentage of the clinical trials enrolling, but we don't actually, right? We're about 7 to 8%. So what we have are clinical trials that don't look like our population. This is a problem. And I think I know the way to increase diversity in clinical trials is, I'm a real big advocate of talking about clinical trials to people before they're even diagnosed. Before you're even diagnosed, you should know what a clinical trial is, because nobody wants to hear on the day they're diagnosed about a clinical trial. They're still processing the information. Studies have shown that the moment you tell somebody that they have cancer, they don't hear anything else after that word cancer. They don't, and I've seen it firsthand, where I will break the news to someone and I've gone on to say X, Y, Z. And when I see them at the next visit, they have no clue of what I said, understandably so. And studies have shown that's actually what happens. So I'm a firm believer of, before you're diagnosed at all, cancer, hypertension, whatever it may be, you should know what a clinical trial is. You should be open to that knowledge. So in the event you are diagnosed with whatever, that you understand what a clinical trial, and that inherent distrust is gone. And that you know going in, okay, I can have the standard of care, or I can have what they think will be the better than a standard of care. So I'm a big advocate of just everybody at the beginning, base education, based on knowledge. What is a clinical trial, and why does it benefit me? Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Jacobs.
No, I'm shaking my head in total agreement with you. I love that. What I'm doing with a lot of my patients, we talk about clinical trials, and when we have one, I like to give them that information. But the other thing I do, there's some observational studies that go on, and it kind of whets their appetite about it. Like there are thousands of us that were in the smartwatch observational trial for heart rate and for AFib. All you had to do was put your smartwatch on and participate in that particular observational study. So I have a lot of friends now. They actually texted me, "You got another one?" That was fun. And so it was observational studies, and so slowly kind of, okay, so you got observational studies. Now we can talk a little bit more about clinical trials, and we can let you know when because now they're asking me about them now. I got a text just the other day. Can you send us a link for some of the observational studies? I said, oh, very good, very good. You guys, I love it. So if we can get you engaged and get you to the point where, because I had a lot of friends and relatives at one point, felt like doctors were getting paid to prescribe medications. That, so if you prescribe, you get the kickback from writing those prescriptions. You get the kickback from ordering MRIs. And I said, no, we're not. So teaching them, no, you have to trust us. We're doing what we feel is best. But if you want to have some input on how we treat hypertension, how we treat diabetes, feel free to join some of the clinical trials. And here are some of them. Bring them to me if you have questions, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about it. We've actually done some groups. I've conducted some groups where we've done a Zoom meeting, and we put the trial up, and we actually talked about it. Everybody that was on the call had hypertension. And so I talked to them about the ins and outs of that particular trial. And believe it or not, several of them signed up for it. So just another trusted person in the community.
Yeah, I think it goes a long way to have conversations like this, conversations that are just conversations. You're not trying to sell anything. You're not trying to push any medications or any drugs. You're literally just sharing the information and just educating folks on some of the background. I think anything you can do to kind of, get rid of some of those fears and those trepidations behind it is a big deal. Like it just drops that wall a little bit so you don't feel so closed off to it. And I love the idea of the observational studies leading the way into clinical trial. That's like a perfect little like, hey, it wets your whistle a little bit on that and then get into the real clinical trial. Yeah. But before we continue with some of these healthcare disparities and things and ways and reasons why it's important for minority participation, I don't want to let the show end before I tell everybody about the over-the-counter medications that have gone through the same process. So the things that we don't even hesitate or think twice about when we have an illness or a sickness, they've gone through the same process. There was a time where this didn't exist. And so they were testing to see if aspirin, if Advil, if, Prilosec, if, Mucinex, all of these different medications would help and would work. So I think it just adding to the conversation of, bringing that wall down and showing people that it's not as scary as you think. There's a lot of things that we live on nowadays that have gone through the same process. So before we think, oh, I'm shut off, I don't want to deal with it, I don't want to think about it, it's experimental, it's scary, this is how we have our everyday life medications and things that we take. It has to come from somewhere and it has to get approved somewhere. So, like I said, Tylenol, Aleve, Claritin and Zyrtec, if you've got allergies, we got stock in that medication at this point. It's like, these are medications we live and survive on. So it's like, this is the stuff that we take on a regular basis that had to go through the same process. So, let that be something that can ease some of your fears and concerns when it comes to clinical trials. And if anything, let that be something that's a springboard for you to dive off and do a little bit more research into things, before you just shut your mind off to it. Like, just be a little more open-minded to the fact that this is or could be, a better and new way of life for us. We have a question in the chat that I want to get to here. Rona chimes in and says, what do you do when there are no clinical trials? That's a very good question.
I'm always on a clinical trial.
I always got one.
I always got a clinical trial. Like I mentioned, these clinical trials go on for years, right? So what I do is I'll stay on the clinical trial, I'll design it, I'll manage it. If it gets to a point, for example, I had one clinical trial that stopped enrolling because we will only enroll we agreed to enroll only a certain amount of patients. Okay, great. I'm still watching everybody on that clinical trial, but they'll give me a new one. I'll get a new clinical trial and then I'll start designing and overseeing that clinical trial. So I'm always on a clinical trial.
So if there's none for your particular condition, where can people go to find more information? Like, where can folks research, clinical trials that they can possibly participate in?
Yeah. So in the event you are diagnosed with something, every clinical trial that's registered in the United States, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. Mm-hmm. And it makes it very simple. You can just type in your disease process, right? Whatever it is. And then you can use the filter buttons to filter whatever you need. Now, if you can't locate something there, or even especially if you do locate something on that webpage, I always tell people, take that, whatever you found, back to your provider and say, look, I found something for myself. What do you think about it? And how can I be involved to see if I qualify? Just because it's on the website doesn't mean you necessarily qualify, but it does suggest that there's something out there. So I always say, take that, do your own research at home for your disease process, take it back to your trusted care provider and have a discussion. Is this available to me? How can I get up? Because just because it's not at your facility, that's not to say it's not at the facility down the street or maybe across town. So you always want to make sure that if it's a clinical trial that could benefit you, what are the avenues to get yourself on that clinical trial?
Yeah. And I think one of the other main things that we, have in our community here in the lung cancer community is we have a girl chat, or just a chat group in general. So if any of us find a clinical trial or hear of a clinical trial, like, we're all in different pockets of the community, like each one of us is aligned with different orgs and doing different things. And so we always have kind of our ear to the ground for what's the latest and greatest in the lung cancer space. And so for us, I know that if we find anything that we like or that we think might work for the community, we'll usually share it in the group, So I think I say all that to say, find a group of people that you can connect with who have similar, situations to you, so that if they have best practices, if they have news, if they have updates, you guys can be sharing across the table with each other, and you can have access to that information. So it's not necessarily all the load is on you trying to find what you need for you. Like, you can actually just send up that signal and ask for help, and folks can maybe send you things that they've worked on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. There's support groups everywhere, just about for almost every kind of disease that's out there. And so if you can connect with them, frequently they will have connections to trials that are available out there. So that's a great idea. And of course, your trusted primary care provider will be able, if you find some information, I love that idea to bring them back to them to see if they can find out more information for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, ladies, we only have about 5 minutes left in the show. Is there anything else that you want to share around the clinical trial conversation about, getting rid of the healthcare disparities or leveling that playing field for us, or just in general about what to expect when participating that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of your voice matters. I'm very big on advocating for yourself. I've had patients come up to me and say, well, I found this clinical trial, and have bombarded me with questions and say, explain to me why don't I qualify, and you should not be afraid to voice your opinion to your provider. If you feel like you cannot voice your opinion to your provider, you need a new provider. Very simple. So your doctor should be able to tell you what is available to me, if it's not available to me, why, and so on and so forth. So I'm a big advocate, a big proponent. Advocate for yourself. Make sure your voice is heard. Don't let somebody put your treatment or your care to the wayside. So, and that includes clinical trial options or whatever it may be. Okay.
Right. I'll add to that. I love that because as a primary care provider, we encourage patients to write it down. Bring your questions to us. If you write it down, you won't forget. If you write it down, and no, it does not bother us if you go down a list of questions that you have, because that means we've got a patient that is really engaged and wants to know more about what's going on with them. And if you're interested in the trial, say that I'm interested. Do you know of any trials? I'm very interested, and then that will help your primary care provider be on the lookout for any trials or studies that would be available for you. And always there's an observational study. I keep holding my smartwatch up because I got all kinds of observational studies you can try if you want a little taste of a trial.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure I give you guys the opportunity to shout out your contact information. If anybody wants to continue the conversation, folks, just as a reminder, this will live live on the Facebook and Heal collaborative pages for YouTube as well. So if you're watching this after this is live and ended, feel free to still drop comments, questions, concerns in the chat, and we can always get them back to the wonderful guests here today. But also, I want to make sure that we leave you with the contact information for them as well. So if you want to touch base with them personally, you have the opportunity. So Theresa, why don't you go first and just leave your contact info for the audience, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And then, Cynthia, you can go next and leave yours.
You can email me at tjacobs, and that's Jacobs with an S, GAPHC.org, because one of the other questions we get a lot of, what do you do if you don't have insurance? So we've got, in the state of Georgia, there are community health centers all over the state of Georgia that sees patients without insurance. And then we've got connections for you to see specialists as well. So tjacobs at GAPHC.org. Just send me a quick email if you're looking for a primary care provider where you can hook up and possibly get some additional testing or see some specialists. Let us know if you want to get connected with some trials as well.
Okay. And Cynthia, you're up.
Yeah, if you have any questions about clinical trials, as I mentioned, I do it all day, every day. Feel free to reach out to me at globaloncology.equity@gmail.com. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about clinical trials, appease any concerns, point you in the right direction. I feel it's very important to spread the word about clinical trials and make sure that minorities are well represented in clinical trials. So feel free to reach out with any questions.
Excellent. And folks, you know, my contact information, you can always find me. I am Jaymie Jam on Facebook. Oh, snap, it's Jams on Snapchat. What am I? I always do this every show. I never know what my handles are. It's just Jams on TikTok. And that's good enough for now. If you want to connect with me in any way, shape, or form, please feel free. I want to thank everybody who listened tonight and who tuned in, all the engagement that we had in the chat. You guys are getting rounds of applause from everybody saying that this was super informative. So thank you so much for doing this tonight. I think you've, definitely helped move that needle forward, like we talked about earlier tonight. I would be remiss if I did not mention that you guys need to make sure you go ahead and register for our HEAL Summit that's happening in Houston next year, April the 24th to the 26th. And I believe it's in Houston, Texas. But if you missed this year's African American Lung Cancer Patient and Caregiver Summit, you don't want to miss next year. So make sure you go and check the HEAL Collaborative website to register for that and stay up to date on, just when everything is opening up and what you can expect for the summit. So if I don't hear from you folks, I hope you have a safe and happy new year. Thank you all for rocking with the HEAL Collaborative for this entire year through podcasts. We will continue this straight into the year 2025. We are open to suggestions, topics, and guests. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything you want to talk about or anything that you want to hear. So I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart for being my last podcast for 2024. I appreciate you so much. And this has been an amazing conversation. Everybody have a safe and happy evening, and we'll catch you next year in 2025.